so explain your model of consulting. And I said, yeah, it's really simple. It's shut up, listen, care, and know something. And the interviewer said, go on. And I said, no, I finished. That's it. Now, shut up and listen, critically important, absolutely so important. You'll have seen, everyone's seen the evidence, the scientific evidence for how quickly, on the whole, clinicians interrupt in consultations. Gosh, I was on a panel a few weeks ago, and a consultant from a major London teaching hospital was talking about the need in future for her specialist colleagues to have additional training so they can become generalists. And it's the first time I'd heard a recognition that actually generalism isn't the easy bit that you do on the way to becoming a specialist. The key skills, I think, of GPs.
My guest today is Sir David Haslam, former chair of National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. He was knighted in 2008 for services to the NHS leadership. Hi, David. How are you doing?
I'm really good. Good to be with you.
I'm excited to talk about your journey. Tell us, who was David before the knighthood, before being Nice Chair?
I was born in a medical family. This is going to sound dreadful. My father was a GP, my brother was a GP. Both my sisters were nurses. One of them married a GP. And I chose to become a GP. I think one of the reasons, my dad actually died when I was only 14. And I remember going to his funeral and just, I think, being blown away by the affection that his patients had for him, that he really mattered in their lives. I always wanted to do medicine. General practice sort of always appealed to me. As I say, the rest of my family were GPs. Then my brother, who was a GP, he died of leukemia when I was a medical student as well. And gosh, I learned a lot from the experience of going through that, particularly about how dreadful the communication skills of many of the doctors were, which has given me a sort of passion for things like communication throughout my career. So I became I did a GP training scheme in central Birmingham, and then I became a GP in rural Cambridgeshire. The great musician John Lennon once said, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. And 36 years later, I was still in the same practice in Cambridgeshire, but my career had developed into various other roles towards the end of that time, particularly. So that's the background. An ordinary, pretty average student. I got into university with A-levels that wouldn't have got me anywhere near medical school these days, to be honest. It was different times. I can't believe how lucky I was. My best subjects were the arts rather than the sciences, but I wanted to do medicine, and that's how I ended up where I am.
That's interesting. So you had that influence from an early age. So it must have been really hard when you lost your father and your brother. Tell us about how did you cope at the time?
I think I coped very unhealthily. I mean, without this becoming a psychiatric consultation, I think when my dad died, I just felt this responsibility to be calm and not to make a fuss and to look after my mother and so on. I was the youngest of my family by a very long way, and my siblings had all left home by then. So I don't think that's healthy. It was very British of the time, but it wasn't terribly healthy. When my brother died, when he was ill and in hospital, and he was in hospital where I was a student, the doctors looking after him fundamentally lied to me about what was wrong with him, because they didn't want to either upset me or upset my mother, who didn't know what was wrong either. Gosh, and that just taught me so much about the power of honesty and openness, and whose illness is it anyway? And I think that had a profound influence on my interest in communication skills.
When you think about communication, how do you see it? Sometimes there is an integration of science and also art to communication. How do you see it, David?
Gosh, what a question that is. A few years ago, I was asked to make I think it was a video for the RCGP about communications, about consulting skills. A number of my friends and sort of real experts in communication skills had made very good videos, and so I sat down in front of the interviewer, and they said, "So explain your model of consulting." And I said, "Yeah, it's really simple. It's shut up, listen, care, and know something." And the interviewer said, "Go on." And I said, "No, I finished. That's it. Now shut up and listen." Critically important, absolutely so important. You'll have seen, everyone's seen the evidence, the scientific evidence for how quickly, on the whole, clinicians interrupt in consultations. Shut up and listen. Care, gosh, that sounds cheesy, doesn't it? But by care, I mean be interested. Be interested in the human being sitting in front of you. Um, and know something. Well, that's our professional responsibility. And I think that caring bit of really being interested in the person who's consulting you, you may never have met them before, you may never see them again. It's not the same as having a long-term continuity of care relationship, but you can still be interested. And it makes both of our roles better in that situation.
That's a great model. It's very concise and easy to remember. So, shut up and listen is a big one because the beginning is where you build rapport, and it's really difficult sometimes when trainees have got a lot of things to think about and thinking, what's the next question? They don't really listen. Share with us if you had to unpack the listening part for us, David.
It's one of these things that you're so desperate to get information from the patient, particularly early in your career. I remember working with trainees, registrars in my practice who almost had a checklist by the side of the desk of things they needed to do to do a good consultation. They wrote down things like introduce yourself, make sure you know the patient's name, things like this. To be honest, if you're interested in this person who's come in, and I know it's difficult, it may be the 50th consultation of one sort or another you've had in a day, but it's still just being interested and let them begin to tell you their story. Now, we've all faced patients who are very unable to be concise and who just go on and on and on. But on the whole, you can fairly quickly pick up what it is that the important area is and encourage that direction. But this dates back to Hippocrates. It dates back to sort of, the almost every medical teacher. Listen to the patient, it's a mantra that has been repeated through the ages. And it's just so true. And now I spend more of my time as a patient than as a doctor. You recognize it with doctors when you consult as well. It really matters that they take on board what you're concerned about.
When you think about your career looking back, what are the best moments of your career as a GP?
The best ones, without a doubt, they were cases. There are two sorts. There were the dramatic cases, which I'm almost reluctant to talk too much detail about, but where you genuinely, I'll tell you about one. It was about 2 minutes to 6 on a evening surgery, and the phone went, and the receptionist said, "There's a mother on the phone who's worried. Her child's got a high temperature. Would you have a word with her?" And the mum spoke to me, and the mum said, "I just got one thing I need to know. My son's got this high temperature. Is it safe to use both ibuprofen and paracetamol?" And I said, you can alternate the doses, but pharmacologically, it's absolutely fine. And anything else you're concerned about? And she said, "I'm just a bit worried about this funny rash he's got." And I literally dropped everything, said goodbye to the patient who was in my consulting room, speeded round to this house where I watched the rash of meningococcal septicemia spreading before my eyes, gave some intravenous penicillin, obviously sent for an ambulance urgently. And it was when he came into my surgery a month later and just came over and said, "Thank you, doctor." You can't beat that. I mean, it was extraordinary. And, every doctor has experiences like that in their career. And I was so glad that we got on to the mention of the rash. It would have been terribly easy to have put the phone down, or for her to have put the phone down. Because he would have died.
Wow, that's an amazing story. And Sounds like you had that instinct and you followed your instinct and went straight and rushing.
Shut up and listen.
Absolutely. Yeah. So tell us about how did you develop your career? Because you also became the chair of the RCGP.
Well, throughout the early years of my career, I'd also got into a lot of medical journalism. This was pre-internet days, but there were a lot of, I think at one time, there were about four publications that went to every general practitioner every week. General practitioner newspaper, Pulse, Medical News. Oh, there was another couple as well, which went out slightly less frequently. And I realized I enjoyed writing. I enjoyed using humor as much as I could in stories about medicine. And so for 6 years, I'd written a weekly column for General Practitioner newspaper. And so when I stood for election to the Council of the Royal College of GPs, I was elected, and I'm sure I was elected because people recognized my name. And they also, I mean, if they'd read my stuff, they knew the sort of person I was. Um, and I think, to be honest, everything flowed from that. Name recognition counted for a lot. Um, I never, ever intended to become chairman. I remember when I first joined the council, I looked at whoever was then the chairman. I remember turning to the person next to me and saying, wild horses wouldn't drag me into doing that job. It just looks a nightmare. But a few years later, a friend of mine suggested that I stand for election. And by then I'd developed what I've talked about previously. I call it my deathbed test. Imagine myself aged 99 with any luck, looking back on my life and saying, would I had wished I'd tried? And it's so, and I think the saddest words in the English language are if only, when you look at things with regret. So if you stand for election or stand for a job or go for an interview for something and you don't get it, you don't get it. That's life. But if you don't try and you wanted to, you'll always regret it. And I thought if I don't give it a shot to stand as chairman, I'll always wonder if I could have done it. And to my surprise and delight, I was elected. So I think that's the message. You know, if you're tempted, not even tempted, if you think you'd regret not trying, try. What's the worst that can happen?
So right now, a lot of GPs who are newly qualified or struggling to get a job, what advice would you give somebody who has worked so hard, 10 years from medical school to becoming a GP? At the end, the prospect doesn't look that great. What would you tell them to apply for a job and keep trying?
Well, I just find it absolutely shameful and astonishing that there are any GPs in that situation. I know it's the case. I think it's a complete failure of workforce planning. It's a complete failure of government policy. It appalls me because there's a desperate need for GPs. I'm encouraged. We're recording this on the day that the NHS's 10-year plan has been launched. And the good news of that is a major role, increased role for primary care, community care, work outside hospitals, a recognition that there's a real need to recruit large numbers of GPs. I think that's fantastic. I've been preaching this, I've been writing this for years, so I'm delighted that's happened. What leaves me slightly bothered is I've also heard secretaries of state say this sort of thing for about the last 20 years, that they're going to do this and they haven't delivered. So this time they've got to deliver. I think I personally believe the role of the GP, the role of the generalist in medicine has never been more important. And that's not just because that's where I come from. It's not just because I'm a GP. As you can see, I'm an old bloke now, but I've got multiple health conditions. The average, there are more people in the UK with two or more long-term conditions than there are with one long-term condition. So the single disease specialty model strikes me as completely outmoded as the cornerstone of healthcare. Generalism has to be the way forward with support from our specialist colleagues. I'm not absolutely decrying specialists. But what I am decrying is the fact that generalists have been devalued for so long. We've had politicians who've talked about the importance of primary care, and then the number of GPs has gone up and up. And the opposite needs to happen. So I've got my fingers crossed that the situation is going to change. I'm beginning to sense that there are more GPs are beginning to find a way into the employed workforce. Don't give up is my message, because I think the pressure is now there to deliver. I'm pretty certain Wes Streeting believes this. It's just whether there is the financial capacity in the system to restructure. But I'm optimistic. So let's keep our fingers crossed there.
In terms of the different health organization, when you were in NICE, what were the things that you didn't agree with the organization or struggle with?
Well, when I was interviewed to become chair of NICE, it was a classic, an absolute classic of what I've described about my deathbed test. I had never dreamed of a role like that. I mean, why would you? My predecessor, the guy who was chair of NICE and was coming to the end of his term, was a brilliant, world-leading academic clinical pharmacologist. And I was a road country GP, and the bit of me was saying, "What on earth do you think you're going for this?" And the other bit of me was saying, "Actually, no, that's what they need is a generalist who has an overview." Particularly as at the time NICE was taking on a remit for social care as well, and the area that I talked about most in my interviews was the issue of multimorbidity and the importance of genuine patient-centeredness. I guess I remember a colleague of mine, a medical colleague of mine, whose mother, he told me this story. His mother suffered from really severe dementia, and she'd had a recent major stroke and a fractured hip. And while in hospital, she was started on a statin. And my friend, doctor, challenged the hospital doctor about the appropriateness of this therapy. And the doctor doing the prescription said, "Well, I prescribed it because that's what the guidelines say I should do." Now, that's nonsense. What the guidelines say is that prescribers should take into account the circumstances of the individual patient. In the case of someone with very severe dementia, a fractured hip, and a recent major stroke, I don't think the prescriber was doing that. So one thing I really tried to flag up in my time with NICE was that they are guidelines. The clue is the word, guidelines, not tram lines. As I say, the guidelines say that prescribers and users of guidelines should take into account the individual patient. Every single piece of guidance carries that it begins with the following words: healthcare professionals are expected to take it fully into account when exercising their clinical judgment. However, the guidance does not override the individual responsibility of healthcare professionals to make decisions appropriate to the circumstances of the individual patient, in consultation with the patient and their guardian or carer, and informed by the summary of product characteristics of any drugs. Okay, so every piece of guidance says that. Take into account the individual patient. And yet I think most users of NICE guidelines treated those words like terms and conditions on an Amazon website. You just flip past them to get to the important stuff. The important stuff is, what dose do I use? No, that's not the important stuff. The important stuff is the individual patient, taking them into account, talking to them, sharing the options. And that's actually, I know, slightly more difficult than simple cookbook medicine, but it's good medicine. And that's the thing that I was really keen to focus on while I was with NICE.
Are you struggling with SCA? Maybe you're practicing cases after cases, yet you're not seeing much progress. If you're looking for help, I've opened up a few spaces. Click the link down in the description to book a call with me, see whether I can help you. And if I can help you, we can make a plan, see how you can pass SCA with confidence.
Personalized medicine is something that's going to be more prominent with genetics, and people would now know which medication would be more effective as well. What are your vision for primary care in the next 5 years?
Oh, how that ties together. Well, I think I've often talked about a patient of mine who had multiple health problems. If I remember rightly, uh, he had osteoarthritis of the hip, he had diabetes, he had coronary artery disease, he had macular degeneration, he had something else. I can't quite remember the full list, and he had prostate cancer. And he'd written to me before a consultation, and he'd sent me links to two papers, one in the New England Journal and one in the Lancet about the management of prostate cancer. And he'd asked me to read these. And when he came in, I said, "Look, there's no, you need to discuss this with your consultant. I'm really not an expert in prostate cancer." And he said, "Dr. Haslam, I know you're not an expert in prostate cancer. You're an expert in me." Gosh, and it gave me a tingle down my spine when I said it, because that was really summing up the role of the generalist. Now, what you're talking about with these personalized medicines and the complexity and the very, very specialist care that some of the new genomics and so on is going to be able to give us isn't going to take away from the fact that the patient with the organ that can be treated in that way is still going to be a whole person with whole person needs, and is still going to need someone to help them through the whole territory of ill health and complexity. There was an RCGP lecture many years ago which talked, I thought, beautifully about the role of the GP not being a gatekeeper, which is one of the phrases that's often used, but as being a mountain guide. The analogy being you're going through difficult territory, but you know a bit more about that difficult territory than the person you're going with. You're not going to guarantee you'll get through, but you're going to bring your experience to take them with you. And people will feel sort of safe with you. And I think that's going to be a fundamental part of the GP role, is being sort of a part of the team, some of whom will be doing this breathtakingly, unimaginably complex, personalized stuff, but others are going to do person-centered stuff, which is just as important.
So sounds like the soft skill of a GP, the person-centered care, empathy, listening, all those would be really
Well, it
important.
might be soft, but it's not easy. We often talk about soft skills as somehow they're the almost in a almost, I know you're not meaning this, but in almost a disparaging way, the jokes about the cardigan wearing GP who just, is nice. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about as someone who's really focused on their patient. And these are difficult skills. I was on a panel a few weeks ago, and a consultant from a major London teaching hospital was talking about the need in future for her specialist colleagues to have additional training so they can become generalists. And it's the first time I'd heard a recognition that actually generalism isn't the easy bit that you do on the way to becoming a specialist. It's the other way around.
That's interesting, yeah. So when I think of a generalist, I think of somebody who's able to connect the dots and see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Where specialists are so defined in one narrow area.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, as you say that, I'm thinking of pixels on a screen. And if one pixel's not right, you can spot it. I mean, even on your sort of ultra HD sort of TV, you can spot and that pixel really matters, but it's the whole picture really matters as well. It's a nice analogy. You're absolutely right. And none of this is to say that the guy who's the specialist who sorts out that damaged pixel isn't really, really important. A few years ago, I had to be treated for cancer. I'm really glad that there are people who are so expert in dealing with that. But that doesn't take away the real ongoing importance of generalists to all of us.
I think the trend has changed a lot. Back in like maybe 20 or 30 years ago, probably there was a lot of GP bashing in hospital.
Yeah.
But nowadays, people recognize the expertise that GP brings. And I have seen it change nowadays, even specialists noticing how difficult it is to be GP.
Yeah, I think that's really good news, really encouraging, and it's a thing I've been talking about for a couple of decades now. I think I remember when I was president of the Royal College of GPs, I remember talking to two people who've been president of the Royal College of Surgeons, and they both said they simply couldn't cope with the risk involved in being a GP. Now, if you were to ask the average person, which is the riskiest job, they would all say it'd be surgery, because it looks really challenging. But compared to and you know, if I'm so cack-handed, if you let me loose in an operating theatre, it'd be a disaster. But compared to the challenge of every patient coming in can have anything wrong with them, and you've no idea what it's going to be. That is extraordinary, and why it's eternally fascinating. And I'm sometimes slightly worried that when I talk up the complexity of general practice, it'll put people off the job. The great thing is that when you're working with colleagues and teams and can share this stuff, it's endlessly stimulating because of that variety.
I think it's important for people to know about it, because sometimes some doctors might join general practice thinking it's easy, but then they find out it's not for them, because then they realize how difficult and complex it is. And I have noticed after the pandemic, the complexity has increased so much. We're seeing so much more complex comorbidities, and it's really difficult for a GP nowadays to do 10 sessions because of the complexity in the workload.
yeah.
So they are now doing maybe 6 or 8 sessions.
Yeah, no, and I completely understand that. In fact, decades ago, there was evidence showing that GPs who for some of their working week had another interest were much less likely to burn out, were much more likely to be to maintain their enthusiasm for the job. Now, that special interest could be playing golf, it could be painting, it could be being a trainer, it could be being getting involved in medical politics, it could be making podcasts, it could be anything, but it's something different as part of the working week. For me, I've already talked about, I did a lot of writing, I also did broadcasting, made quite a lot of TV programs and so on, and I found that really stimulating. And I once used to feel guilty that I needed that extra bit of my working week as well as being a GP, because I spent most of my time, like I still do, saying what a great job it is. And a young doctor I was talking to said he'd worked this out, that looking after a practice was like looking after a crying baby that never stops crying. It's not that you don't love it, it's just every now and again you need a break from it. And I think that's every parent, anyone who's experienced a crying baby knows the truth of that. Just shut up for a bit. and you just need that break. So for me, I however much some doctors of my generation might witter on about, in my day, we all used to do massive long sessions. I don't think it did them any good. I don't think it did their patients any good. Having said that, I do think continuity, the ability to develop a relationship with a doctor, a relationship between doctor and patient is good for both. I think one of the dehumanizing things of a lot of medical practice is when you don't know what happens to your patients. You see them as a one-off. You don't see the results. They're not a person. They're a condition that you treat. I think that applies in hospital medicine as well as in general practice. So building into your system some way that you can get to know a proportion of your patients matters to them, but it'll matter to you as well.
Yeah, you can't pour from an empty cup. So it's really important to take the time and do something else that's going to recharge you. You've written a book recently on side effects, and this book tells about the problems with the healthcare system we've got right now. So show us like a little bit about the book, and also if you had to add a new chapter to the book today, what would it be?
What I was writing about was it was almost a summary of thoughts I developed over my career. And it struck me that in the NHS in particular, the boundaries of what we're trying to do change all the time. Particularly, and I'm not debating whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but look at the mental health diagnoses where the boundaries have shifted really quite dramatically. and people are now seeking help for areas that in the past they wouldn't have sought help. The same applies for many aspects of physical medicine. Pharmaceutical industries constantly developing solutions for which they don't have to find a problem rather than the other way around. We can over-medicalize various aspects of life. So we've got a lack of clarity as to where the boundaries of the NHS are. We've got, therefore, near infinite demand, as everyone working in the NHS knows, and we've got finite resources, and we always will have finite resources. Now, if you put those together, it ends in heartache. You cannot, and I just wanted to try and look at a number of things. How can we be less medical sometimes in our approach? And I write quite a lot about some of the medical practices, like one particularly in Frome in Somerset, which has put a huge amount of effort into almost the social. I'm not terribly keen on the word social prescribing, because I don't think it should be prescribing, but in terms of getting the lives of their patients more linked up, more linked in a social way, and have dramatic results in terms of reduced hospital A&E, emergency department attendances, reduced investigations, reduced presentations to primary care. We can do things in a very different way. I think we over-medicalize. We've got into a curious situation around death, and I'm not talking about the assisted dying debate. I'm talking about, say, seriously demented people in a care home who develop a chest infection and are rushed into hospital, which it might be what they and their family want, and if it is, that's fine. But sometimes it feels as if medicine is doing stuff because it feels guilty if it doesn't, rather than doing the thing that is necessarily best with and for the patient. And I just wanted to discuss a few of these areas. And the under-recognition of prevention, over-treatment, and so on. And I called it side effects because I think, well, I'm a classic example of a side effect of the great benefits of medicine. I told you earlier, my dad died when I was 14. He died 15 years younger than I am now. And in those extra 15 years I've needed treatment for cancer with radiotherapy and chemotherapy. I've had atrial fibrillation that has needed an ablation. I've had an arthritic hip, that's needed replacement, and so on. I'm pretty fit, but I've still had that lot done. That's all a side effect of the great benefits of medicine. We have to plan for these. The sense that somehow prevention is going to reduce cost down track, I'm not sure is true. I think it changes it. And I'm thrilled to bits that prevention kept me alive long enough to develop all these other problems. But I do think we need to explore these. And then there are side effects of government policies. And a classic one for me, the Blair government had an absolute focus in general practice on access and brought in targets that every patient must be seen within 48 hours, and it didn't matter who you saw. And this policy that was extremely well intended was totally successful in having the side effect of destroying continuity. People who wanted to see Dr. Haslam couldn't see Dr. Haslam because I had no appointments for the next 48 hours, but one of my partners did. So continuity is destroyed. What do we know about continuity? Continuity has been shown to reduce admissions. It's been shown to reduce costs. It's been shown to improve patient satisfaction, patient experience. So the side effect of a well-intended bit of government planning actually makes things worse. And I've seen that happen over and over again. So that's why I called my book on this side effects.
Right. So it sounds like you've analyzed this and studied it for a long period of time and had a lot of reflection on it. If you think about the world, where the healthcare system are thriving, and what can the UK borrow from other parts of the world?
Well, I haven't found a perfect one. I don't think anywhere has got it absolutely right. Um, I visited a couple of times Cuba, which is a really interesting example. Cuba is a very poor country. The population is very poor. Doctors are extremely have low pay, but the Cuban government put a focus on things like um, uh, prenatal care, obstetric care, making sure that births were safe. They put a lot of focus on preventive activities, on things like clean water and so on. They ended up with most of the measurable aspects of health outcomes were better than the United States, which was paying many factors more per head of population. And what this said to me is it's not necessarily how much you put in, it's where you put it in. If you put it in the right areas, you can make a huge difference. The States is a classic example. You get people with who get good care, can get very, very good care, possibly the best in the world. Most of the population has worse care than most other sort of advanced countries. And again, it's this lack of focus on primary care, particularly the underinvestment in primary care. You asked me where's the best. I think the Netherlands do pretty well, but they're none of them are perfect. All of them have got aspects that are good. We know all that. I mean, you'll know all the work around the Commonwealth funds done in this country, saying for many years we were at the top for almost everything apart from outcomes. Now outcomes matter, so we have to get both of those right. But I think putting the focus more into primary care, hopefully into prevention. Again, the 10-year plan is talking about these. Well, for heaven's sake, this time let it happen.
Yeah, I'm hoping so. So for somebody who's listened up until now, who has got the next 30 years of career in general practice, what would you say to that person?
What I'd say is I haven't a clue what your career is going to be like, because it's going to change. And I'd say this to anyone, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It'll be very, very different. I think any of us, the speed of technological change is quite extraordinary. The thing, and so AI, it is of course mandatory to mention AI at a time that this AI will have an impact. It certainly will, and probably for the best. Now, what I'm hoping and praying is that AI will allow doctors and nurses and other clinicians to be able to spend more time on the human bits of care, and less time on the organizational bits of care and the record keeping and all the rest. I've been struck for a very long time that if you read Shakespeare, forget the language, the out-of-date language of Shakespeare. The emotions expressed by the humans in Shakespeare are all totally recognizable to a modern audience. Fear and lust and jealousy and anxiety and so on. The human emotions are all unchanged. That's 400 and something years ago. Why are they going to be any different 30 years from now? I think those human bits are still going to be there. And they're really going to need the thing that AI, I just don't think AI will ever really be able to replicate: humanity, caring. And again, I don't mean this in a silly, psychobabble way. I mean in a real human to human. I'm struck. This afternoon I've seen my GP for a routine checkup. I left the room feeling that he cared about what happened to me. That matters. I don't think Siri or Alexa or whatever the future of AI is going to be will be able to do that in quite the same human way. So there's really going to be a place for you. Shut up, listen, care, and know something. Then knowing something will be made easier with AI, but it'll still require wisdom to apply it.
I think that's very important because when you think about it, let's say a GP is having to do breaking bad news to a patient. Having a human speaking with that patient makes a big difference because the human being can relate. Whereas the AI, we don't really know whether there's any life in it. It's just like just giving the information, but it's a really different experience in itself.
Yeah, absolutely right. One of the things I've found really interesting over the last few years, probably triggered by COVID, when we all started to meet on Zoom like we're doing now, or Teams or whatever, and consultations were there. How there really is something missing. And I don't think it's as simple as being in the same room and getting body language. I think there is, all of us, I think, felt after the pandemic, when you started to be with people in the real world again, there was just a different quality to those meetings, to those relationships. And I don't think we have a clue what that is yet, what force that is. I don't know, but I'm completely convinced about it. And I think things like touch are extraordinarily important. And again, a combination of COVID and anxiety about being complained about, I think, has sort of taken a lot of touch out of care. But I think touch matters. I think we have to find our way back into this, the need to hold someone's hand when they're frightened. Even, you know, in my career, and it was a long time ago, I remember there were people who needed hugging. Now, I think young doctors now would feel very, very wary of that. And indeed, I'd probably feel wary of that. But I think as a species, we need to find a way back that those human bits can become important again.
I think that's very important. And I think there are some studies on it where the orphans who didn't receive touch, they were not growing as much
Yeah.
as those who had touch. So it is a basic human needs, as you say. And going back to basics is very important based on the human creatures as an emotional person who they really need this. So it's been really interesting to speak with you and talk about your experience and insight. Anything that we haven't touched before we wrap up that you'd like to say, David?
Gosh, I mean, well, that's about the broadest, most open question I think I've ever been asked. And that's great, because open questions, of course, do. Uh, I think I remember a friend of mine talking to me once about one of the key skills I think of GPs is there's an ancient word, I think, which dates back to ancient Greece, called phronesis, which is the technical definition or something like that is practical wisdom. But the definition I like to use is it's the art of knowing what to do when you don't know what to do. And I think actually for all of us in general practice, we'll have situations that you have never, ever come across before. And there is no guideline that tells you absolutely clearly what to do, but you can work out a way through it, working with your patient, knowing where to seek help, that you know what to do when you don't know what to do. And I think that's something that really distinguishes doctors, perhaps from most of our other clinical colleagues. I think it's one of our key responsibilities. And I think that's something I hope we can retain, to recognize that is the wisdom that comes over and above whatever stage of your career you're in. You can learn techniques that get you through this.
That's great. Yeah. I think navigating uncertainty is one of the most difficult things for GPs who are in the early stage of their careers or like trainees. And there are different techniques, as you mentioned, and also mental models that people can follow with that. So where can people find more about your work?
They can, well, I'd be delighted if they had a look at my book, which is, as I say, it's called Side Effects: How Our Healthcare Lost Its Way and How We Fix It. I've got a website, www.haslam.org, O-R-G. Not a huge amount on there, but that will give you some more information. But the key thing, maybe the final thing I'll say is for me, one of the most important things for my career was to keep mixing with enthusiasts, to find a group of people that you can work with, who keep you enthused about what you're doing. It is a difficult job. We all moan about it. Uh, I've moaned as much as any. You know, you have days that are lousy and days you go home and you think, oh God, I can't do this any longer. But actually, if you can have a group of colleagues that you meet with occasionally and talk about the bits that went well, the bits that have excited or interested you or puzzled you or whatever, that's a really important way of keeping going. And that I would commend. And that can be if you're involved in training or education, or just get a group of you, go to the pub once a month. It doesn't matter how you do it. I think it really matters.
Absolutely. It's being part of a community of other people who are like-minded and have this positive energy. And I think that's really important. Yeah, I say. So thank you so much for sharing your insights today. If you enjoyed this video, you found it useful, please share in the comment what was the main takeaway you got from this podcast. And I'll see you on the other side. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.